Hi, everybody. Welcome. I think that we are going to get started. Logan, do you mind flipping back to the previous slide? Thanks. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the training, Integrating Climate Risk into Long-Term Planning. If this is where you are supposed to be, great. Thank you for joining us. And just so everybody knows right now and for the duration of these presentations, this training is going to be recorded. Logan, can you flip to the next slide? Thanks. So before we get started, we wanted to just put a few tips out there to help make this meeting run smoothly. So when you are not speaking, if you don't mind muting your microphone so that we don't get background noise. This will turn out much better if you are able to use headphones and headphones that have a microphone. If you have questions at any point in time, or if you want to speak, please just use the chat box and we'll be monitoring that chat box. We will also be recording any of those questions that we don't get to in a parking lot for questions so that we're able to answer them later on in the sessions. When you are going to speak, we would really appreciate it if you introduce yourself before you speak. And if you're able to, feel free to share your video throughout the training. We really feel that if you want to get the most out of this, please share your experiences. We're here to learn from everybody. Ask as many questions as you'd like. And if you have an opportunity, please do review materials in between the trainings. As I said, this training is going to be recorded, so you will have access to these videos after the fact. But just so you know, anything that you type or say is going to be recorded during the main session. Just to give you a little bit of an overview of the project that this training is occurring under, this training is sponsored by the USAID Transparency and Long-Term Strategies Project. The goal of that project is to enhance the capacity of countries in long-term modeling and forecasting of low-emission development alternatives, and specifically LTSs, long-term strategies. This project goes through September of 2021, and it includes trainings such as this one, best practices on long-term strategies, planning and development, as well as bilateral country support for planning. And that's something that we'll talk about in session 4. This specific training, Integrating Climate Risk into Long-Term Planning, we hope for you to walk away with kind of 3 main things from it. First and foremost, we hope that you understand the concept and importance of transparency for long-term climate change planning. We hope that you walk away with an understanding of how to integrate and mainstream climate considerations into both sectoral and economy-wide planning processes. And by the end, that you have created a preliminary LTS action plan that also includes climate risk considerations and transparency. We are going to be delivering this material over 4, really 5 sessions. The very first session, session 0, hopefully you already received, and that was the pre-training materials. We hope you had a chance to review and look through those. Today's session, session 1, is focused on introduction to LTS and transparency concepts. The next session on Wednesday will focus on looking at climate risk and how do you integrate those climate risk considerations into your planning. Our third session will focus on data and modeling and how you link that data and modeling into long-term planning. And lastly, in our last session, we hope to complete an action plan for looking at LTS and climate risk. We have a great team here today. I am not going to read through everybody's names because we are going to do introductions. Myself here, I'm in the upper right-hand corner. My name is Jen Leash, and I am here with ICF and this great team of people. So logistically, this is very important. All of your training materials are in a Google folder. And Katie or Sam, if you can drop a link to that Google folder in the chat box, that would be great. In this Google folder, you will find several folders as well as a sign-in sheet. And that sign-in sheet is really, really important if you want credit for this course, but also we're going to use that sign-in sheet to do introductions. So if you can go in right now and sign in on that sign-in sheet, Katie has dropped a link to the Google Drive in the chat box. So if you can open the Google Drive, you will see that sign-in sheet link. And it's going to ask for your name, country, and email address. In addition to that sign-in sheet, we have presentation materials that will be in both English and Spanish. Additional resources, country folders, which we will use later when we walk through some of our exercises, as well as links to a breakout room, as well as our battery bank or parking lot for questions that come up that we aren't able to get to. So using our sign-in sheet, we are going to go through some introductions. We're going to try to be as brief as possible and ask you your name, the country that you do your work in, your title, organization, who you work for, and then please tell us one new thing you have learned during quarantine. And so I will start with this just to give everybody an example. And then what we're going to do is we're going to call your name from the sign-in sheet and ask you to unmute your microphone. If you'd like to show us your video, that's great. And give us your introduction. Name, where you work, your title and organization, and tell us one new thing you have learned during quarantine. So again, my name is Jen Leash. Most of the work that I do actually focuses on Southeast Asia. I'm a clean energy consultant with ICF. And during quarantine, I've actually learned to bake sourdough bread. And I'm sure I'm not the only person here on this call that can say the same thing. So next, Didi, can you give us an introduction?
Hello, can you hear my voice? Okay, hello everyone. Good evening, actually, from Indonesia. My name is Dedi. Indonesia right now. It's raining right now. Hopefully, you can be researcher in the climate program. I learned during the quarantine is actually to learn the whole module of the space target. That's kind of technical, but yeah, I learned a lot about the science-based target initiatives, and of course, I learned about how to work out more because we need to keep the stamina of ourselves here. So really looking forward for the discussion today. Thank you.
Great, I think we have Kareem next.
Hi, good day, everybody. My name is Kareem Reynolds, and I'm representing the country of Belize. I work with the National Climate Change Office of the country now. So most of my work just includes, I guess, doing overall both adaptation and climate change mitigation actions that we do under the office. So it's very, very unique, you know. And one thing that I learned during this quarantine is pretty much how to utilize these virtual training platforms. I mean, we have been really utilizing these things and the many different platforms that we have. I would think that I am now an expert in these virtual training platforms. So that is something that I learned.
Great, well, hopefully you can help us out then. Next on the sign-in sheet is Lucia.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lucia Vesca. I'm from Mexico, and I am actually working on a non-governmental organization called COI-MX. One thing that I learned during quarantine is to be more productive. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucia. Mikhail.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Michaela Andrew from the small island of St. Lucia. I am an economist and independent consultant, and I am currently working with the Global Green Growth Institute, GGGI, on a climate budget tracking system for St. Lucia. During the quarantine period, I have learned the fact that working from home, including working out from home, is perhaps the most efficient in terms of time and outcomes that I could possibly do. And I would not have learned that had it not been for the quarantine. Thank you.
That's great. Sandy. Oh, sorry, Cindy. Apologies.
It's okay. Good morning, good day, everyone. Cindy Singh. I'm from Trinidad and Tobago. I work at the Ministry of Planning and Development in the Multilateral Environmental Agreements Unit as climate change specialist. What have I learned during quarantine? I've improved on some gardening skills, growing some herbs and so on here and there.
Great. I'm going to come over for dinner. Mark.
Hi, good day, everyone. My name is Mark. I'm also from Trinidad and Tobago. I also work in the Ministry of Planning and Development, specifically the Socio-Economic Policy Planning Division as a research assistant. And one thing that I learned during quarantine was managing work and life while working remotely. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Larissa.
Hello, good morning. My name is Larissa Cartwright. I work at the Department of Environmental Planning and Protection in the Bahamas. And one thing that I've learned during quarantine was that I actually can work from home with my very active 18-month-old son.
I'm sure other folks are learning that same thing. Edgar.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I am Edgar Carrillo. I'm an economist and a clean technology consultant based on Mexico City. I mainly work within the clean energy sector, but as many of you know, currently that is a tough sector to work in here in Mexico. So I am right now working with UNDP and persistent pollutants project within Guadalajara, Mexico. And one thing I learned from the coronavirus is that the true meaning of freedom.
Great. We have Beatrice.
Hello, everyone. I'm Beatrice from Spain and currently working on a climate change cooperation project that is a European Union flagship project to support 18 Latin American countries on their goals to achieve NDCs and related UNFCCC mandates. And specifically, I would say I work more with Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, and El Salvador. And something that I have learned during this quarantine, like Cindy, related to gardening, I've learned how to compost my organic waste. That has been really interesting process.
Thanks, Beatrice. Marian.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Marian Lewis from Trinidad and Tobago. I work in the Ministry of Planning and Development in the Socio-Economic Policy Planning Division. That's where we do national long-term development planning. And one thing I learned over the pandemic period is to do some baking, like banana pancakes, and also to do virtual meetings, all the different software packages out there. Thank you.
We'll have to swap some recipes, it sounds like. Arana.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Aaron Apifum. I'm a Senior Environmental Officer with the Department of Environmental Planning and Protection, the Ministry of the Environment in the Bahamas. One thing I've learned during this pandemic is that I miss my office. It is so much easier to work without two teenage children and your wife trying to work around one dining room table.
Great. Kishan?
Good morning, all. Kishan Kumar Singh, Trinidad and Tobago. I'm head of multilateral environmental agreements at the Ministry of Planning and Development. And I've learned how to cook a few new dishes. I like to cook, it's very relaxing. Helps with the pandemic.
Wonderful. Javier?
Hello, everybody. My name is Javier Eduardo Mendoza, and I work for the French Corporation, working closely together with the Ministry of Environment of Colombia. I'm the project manager of the LTS of Colombia, the E2050, and the thing I learned during this quarantine, perhaps the use of these platforms, because we're not so common to me, at least. And of course, I reinforced the importance of my family and how to separate work for the family spaces. Thank you.
Thanks, Javier. Nikita?
Hello, my name is Nikita Hamilton, but you can call me Charles. I am an independent consultant that works around climate change and public health issues. So a part of my company, NCH Strategy Group. And the one thing I've learned in the pandemic is to be grateful for a lot more things in my life. So being a bit more mindful. And I'm from the Bahamas.
Great, thank you. I'm going to skip our trainers, if that's okay, and continue down the list. Ruth. Ruth, are you here?
Hi, good morning. Sorry, I'm trying to find the mute button.
That's okay.
My name is Ruth Phillips City. I'm the National Climate Finance Advisor based in St. Lucia within the Department of Sustainable Development. Yeah, I think to repeat some others, one thing I'm learning still is balancing all the different platforms to still continue working from home and also spending time more with my family.
Thank you. Kelly.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kelly Witkowski. I lead the Climate Change and Natural Resource Program at the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture. And similar to some of the others, I am learning to balance working from home with two very young kids, and happy I'm home on one hand, but also very much missing my office to be able to be a little bit more efficient on the other. Pleasure to see you all today. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thanks, Kelly. Manuela.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Manuela Rios. I work at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Colombia at the Group of Environmental Affairs, and I am in charge of climate change issues. One thing I've learned during these pandemics, because I've been staying at home since March, is I learned to do a great tortilla de patatas and pizza.
Awesome. I'm not sure I know how to pronounce this. Kaylee? I'm sure I pronounced it incorrectly. I'm sorry. Are you here, Kaylee?
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can now.
Oh, okay then. Sorry. Good morning. My name is Dr. Calais Philippe.
Calais.
I work in the Ministry of Health in the Bahamas, and I'm the focal point for climate resilient health systems. It's a new title. It's pretty interesting. And I work along with the Department for Environmental Planning and Protection in collaboration with our National Climate Change Committee. And what I learned over the course of the pandemic is really to deepen my faith and my spiritual need for God in meditation and prayer that helped me to get through the uncertainty. So that's what I learned.
Thanks. Jonathan David.
Hi everyone, this is Jonathan. I'm currently working for UNDP for the Colombian Low Carbon Development Strategy as a sectorial professional on the mining and energy sector. One of the things I learned during this pandemic is how I became obsessive compulsive on the cleaning side.
That's great. Maybe
it was quite a good learning.
Donette.
Hi, Donette Shalry. I work with the Department of Economic Development, which is also the national designated authority to the GCF. Two things I learned during the quarantine period is that you don't have to be physically located in the office to be efficient and effective. And the second thing is how so easy it is to put on weight and how difficult it is to lose. Yeah.
Thanks, Donette. I saw we had a couple of other folks join who perhaps haven't had a chance to sign in on the sign-in sheet. Can you please introduce yourselves? Or maybe not. Okay. We will quickly do some introductions among the team as well. I will head back up. We can start with Katie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Katie O'Malley. I'm with ICF from the United States, and I do a lot of work with greenhouse gas accounting, emissions projections, and during quarantine, I have learned how to do embroidery and needlepoint threading. It's been a nice new hobby I've picked up.
Thanks, Katie. Marian?
Hi, everybody. I'm Marian Van Pelt. I'm also with ICF. My experience has been primarily in recent years with international capacity building on greenhouse gas emission inventories and MRV. What I've learned during quarantine, believe it or not, is relearning calculus because I have to help my kids get through their math. And during this period, the remote learning has been quite challenging. So I'm relearning how to do some of those math problems that we all learned in school.
Logan.
Hi, everyone. This is Logan Pfeiffer. I'm also with ICF. I work in the US. And one thing I've learned during quarantine is the ever variable in-home workout training sessions.
And I have saved for last Sam, because Sam is going to kick us off into our training materials. And one thing perhaps that I can say before I pass this off to Sam is we have a really great group of people here. And, you know, I know a lot of you have a lot of deep experience in LTS and NDCs. So I'm really hoping we can all do a lot of learning from each other over the next few sessions or the next couple of weeks. And with that, Sam, I'm going to pass it off to you for an introduction and to kick us off on our training materials.
Great, thanks, Jen. Well, hello, everyone. I'm Sam. I also work with ICF in the United States. And before we dive in, I guess a couple things I've learned during the quarantine period is how much I appreciate time spent outside and just getting out of my house, and also making pasta. So I think a little bit of cooking, a little bit of mindfulness, as sort of we all have maybe done throughout this year. So thank you all for joining us today. We're really excited to get started. Logan, if you could flip to the next slide. Thank you. So now that we've gotten to know each other a little bit better, and hopefully we'll continue to do so throughout these training sessions, I think we can dive straight into the content. So up on the screen right now are our objectives for today's specific training. So hopefully by 12 o'clock today, you will be able to define long-term strategies and understand why they're important. You're going to learn the various components of long-term strategies, hear a little bit and explain about transparency and its various requirements, as well as understanding and describing the connection between long-term strategies and transparency. And we're also going to do a little bit of an exercise where you'll be able to understand and identify a long-term strategy context for your specific country and sector. Go ahead. Thanks, Logan. So first and foremost, we're going to be talking about long-term strategies a lot. So I think, what are they? Why are they important? We're going to dive straight into that. So first, I'll just say long-term strategies can be associated with a couple other terms. So you may hear things like mid-century plans or long-term low emissions and development strategies. But for the purposes of this training, all of those things are going to be referred to as LTS, or long-term strategies. So what are long-term strategies? So LTS, or long-term strategies, are a country's strategy or plan that sets out a vision and pathway towards sustainable low-emission development to the mid-century, so to 2050. So I'll just note that these plans aren't a new requirement, nor are they really an entirely new process. They're just really building upon what countries are already doing in their national planning, so processes like your NDC development. So long-term strategies encompass and assist a couple different things. So as well as setting out this like high-level vision, they're also going to help countries conduct target setting and identify development priorities that help achieve mid-century greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. They also can encompass specific climate change and development goals, and they're also going to outline specific implementation methods and pathways to actually achieve those goals. So now that we, oh, go ahead, Logan, thank you. So now that we have a general idea of what long-term strategies actually are, I think we should talk a little bit about why are they important and why we even should we be talking about these in the first place? Why should your country be working towards a long-term strategy? So the first thing I'll say is that countries may consider the development of long-term strategies because these are strongly encouraged in the Paris Agreement, and we'll discuss this a little bit in greater detail shortly. So, but importantly, long-term strategies are important because they can help countries establish these long-term visions for the future. So where do you see your country going? What would you like to see in the next 30 years? And that high-level vision can help prioritize some mid and short-term actions to take in the intervening period. So relatedly, long-term strategies based on that high-level vision and that informing of short and midterm actions can inform the development of national plans, perhaps some sector plans, or subnational activities. So those high-level visions can sort of trickle down and help inform very concrete, specific actions that can be taken in your country. And lastly, long-term strategies, as I mentioned, are already building upon the work that you're already doing in existing planning documents, like your NDCs or national adaptation plans, SNAPs, or even just like high-level development plans. So this is sort of a snapshot or a glimpse into why long-term strategies are things that your country should be starting to think about in the future. Okay, so now that we know what these long-term strategies are and why they're important and a piece of conversation to be having in these countries, and we understand that they're helping countries sort of delineate these long-term development, climate, and sustainability targets with this high-level broad vision, I think we should perhaps understand what exactly is included in an LTS. So what are its various components? So one thing I'll say first off is that long-term strategies are not uniform by any means. They're going to vary between countries depending on the specific context and capabilities, differing priorities and resources. So the level of detail and comprehensiveness between country long-term strategies may differ. So while not all of these elements have to be included, there are several pieces that are commonly interspersed throughout long-term strategies that have been developed already, that we've seen already. So I'm going to discuss a couple of these in greater detail, but these various components are, of course, highlighted on the right side of your screen right now. So first and foremost, at the top, that sort of dark green, turquoise green box is a long-term vision or goal related to sustainable development. So we've already sort of touched upon this. This is sort of the crux of what a long-term strategy is. But as I've said, this is the big picture. What is it the country wants to do? What are its main goals? In 30 years, at 2050, what would you have liked to achieve? So Similar to that, another key component are greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. So this is the light blue box up at the top of the screen. And these, as I've said, will build upon determinations and plans that have been made in your NDCs, but they will set out targets based on a longer time scale. So it'll be projections out to 2050 versus the shorter time frame of the NDCs. So another related concept would be some of these adaptation or sector-specific objectives. So this is the green in the center of this diagram. These may build upon the adaptation goals set out in a national adaptation plan or similar planning documents, or it could specifically determine a key sector that you've identified where you want to focus a lot of your resources in the short and midterm for your greenhouse gas reduction goals. So perhaps that means that in your long-term strategy, you've specifically said that the power sector is a key area that we want to focus to cut back on our emissions. So related to some of those adaptation sector goals, all of these targets are being laid out, and one of these key things that can also be included are climate risk considerations, so that interconnects with our greenhouse gas emission targets and our adaptation goals. So we'll talk in much greater detail about climate risk considerations throughout the course of this training, but in the context of a long-term strategy, this can include specific callouts or policies that explain the importance of and attention required to address development in the context of climate change and the ever-increasing impacts we're seeing over time. But it also could just include specific references to a need to increase resilience or to address climate change writ large. So all of these are sort of high-level targets and goals and objectives. So a key aspect of the long-term strategy as well is not only to delineate these objectives, but actually to talk about how those are going to be achieved. So these are your implementation pathways, which you can see on the bottom left of this diagram. So these implementation pathways are the tools and the methods within which these objectives are actually going to be pursued and achieved. And then not only, lastly, and importantly, related to the implementation pathways, so you've tracked out how exactly you're going to achieve these objectives, and associated with that are monitoring and improvement processes. So not only do you need specific methods to achieve these goals, but you also need to insert some strategies to record the progress and ensure that benchmarks are being met and you're able to report out on the progress that you've made towards these objectives. So this is sort of an overview of the various components that we'll see in long-term strategies throughout. But we'll also talk a little bit more about sort of the varied levels of comprehensiveness and ambitiousness of long-term strategies. So Logan, if you want to slide to the next one. Great, thank you. So as I mentioned previously, these are not uniform. Long-term strategies are not necessarily the same across countries, and a lot of it has to do with differences in capabilities and resources. So this graphic from left to right sort of denotes the different iterations or versions of a long-term strategy, if you will, that you could have in your country. And perhaps initially, countries just have this base version, which you see on the far left of the diagram, which really is just a document that captures this high-level vision, these broad sweeping objectives and goals that you really want your country to achieve by 2050. And then perhaps from there, you're able, priorities shift or resources change, and you're able to iterate and create this intermediate version. And perhaps that builds upon that long-term vision you've initially set out, but starts to incorporate some of these very concrete specific objectives like greenhouse gas reduction goals, or those sector objectives I mentioned before, for example. And then perhaps yet again, things shift once more and you're able to put together a very ambitious and very comprehensive LTS. And so that would build upon the previous version to then also conclude a comprehensive implementation plan. So those sort of that checklist of action items, what are the methods that you can take to implement these goals, as well as those monitoring processes to ensure that you're actually checking in to make sure all those goals are being met, you're reporting on your progress and communicating that effectively. So essentially, technical and financial resources, human resources, and priorities can change over time, and they can increase over time to help build a more comprehensive and detailed long-term strategy. Now, I mentioned before that one of the reasons to care about a long-term strategy is that it is strongly encouraged in the Paris Agreement. So I pulled the text from the Paris Agreement is in that box in the top of your screen. And essentially in Article 4, the Paris Agreement strongly encourages in the year 2020 for countries to communicate their long-term strategy. So since we know that these country strategies or policy frameworks build upon the plans and targets set out in your NDCs and other policies like your national adaptation plans or your country development strategies, I wanted to discuss some of the key differences between NDCs and LTS as laid out in the Paris Agreement, which you can see denoted in the table on your screen. So as we all know, NDCs are mandatory and they're based on shorter time scales, so 5 to 10 years. These have to be updated every 5 years. These define very specific greenhouse gas emission reduction targets and implementation plans. In contrast, long-term strategies are voluntary, but strongly encouraged. And they also, of course, have this sort of longer view, this longer time scale going all the way to 2050. So there are a lot of connections between these two types of planning documents, but they are not necessarily identical. So I wanted to give you a sense of how they relate to one another. And I have, Logan, if you could flip to the next slide. Thank you. So this is exactly it, building on the relationship between long-term strategies and NDCs, because while they're not identical, they are related to one another. So they can inform each other or be developed in tandem. So this graphic you're seeing in front of you, the NDCs are denoted by the orange arrows and long-term strategies by the green or turquoise. And it's essentially just showing the time scales, which are denoted horizontally. So as you can see clearly here, the long-term strategies are over a considerably longer time scale projecting out to 2050. And we can see the sort of, regular updates and intervals of the NDCs. And the turquoise arrows that connect between the two of them is just to show that these could be done in conjunction with each other. So you could be setting out your concrete short-term NDC objectives, and that could blend into your higher level long-term strategy goals, but the converse is also true. So in the development of your long-term strategy with this broad high-level view, that can help inform some of the concrete actions you've decided to target in your NDC. So, okay, now we have a general understanding of what long-term strategies are, their importance and sort of the varied elements that come to play, and their relationship to the Paris Agreement and NDCs. So I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Katie, and she's going to walk us through a couple actual examples of country long-term strategies in practice.
Thanks, Sam. Great. So now that we've discussed some of the essential components of LTS, I'll talk about specific examples and highlights across LTS that have been submitted. As of August 2020, 17 countries have officially submitted LTS to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. We have a few examples on this slide here and a link to the UNFCCC website where submissions are located in case any of you would like to look at some examples. Great, so jumping into a few specific examples here, we can see some of the focus areas and the range of countries who have submitted their LTS. Costa Rica submitted their LTS to the UNFCCC in December of 2019, and they have a long-term vision and goal related to sustainable development with a strong focus on resilience through their 10 decarbonization action goals. The Costa Rica LTS is located in the resources folder on our shared Google Drive in case any of you would like to access that more easily, so we can send that link out. Fiji has a particularly interesting LTS because it's a small island nation facing complex climate threats and vulnerabilities. Fiji aims to address climate risk considerations and reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050 across all sectors of its economy through pathways defined in the LTS. We've also added a copy of Fiji's LTS to the Google Drive, as it may be helpful for some island nations as an example. Japan's LTS, the third here listed on this screen, includes a GHG reduction target of 80% by 2050. It has a strong focus on new innovations and technologies, such as storage batteries, hydrogen, nuclear energy, and carbon capture and sequestration in the energy sector to reduce emissions. So already across these three examples, there's a pretty diverse focus across these. So Mexico has also submitted their LTS, named their Climate Change Mid-Century Strategy. It was submitted in 2016 and specifically presents implementation pathways, such as educational programs and effective knowledge diffusion in their strategy. So what Sam was mentioning earlier with implementation pathways, Mexico is a really helpful example of those. Portugal emphasizes a sectoral approach to reducing emissions and focusing on sectors that have the greatest emissions contributions. So each sector has a clear and well-defined modeling and projection assumptions for their emissions. And we'll talk a little bit more about sector-specific projections in the next few slides in our next example. Finally, the United Kingdom's LTS specifies a monitoring and improvement process that's essential to any type of countrywide plan, but especially those that cover such a long time period. The UK vows to report annually on performance and has identified key indicators to measure progress. And this is something that we'll talk a little bit more about in session 4. Great, and I see a couple questions coming in too, so we can definitely respond to those as they come in. Thank you. All right, so now that we've looked at a couple high-level examples, we're going to focus in on the Republic of the Marshall Islands. Their LTS was submitted in 2018, and I'll read this quote from the beginning of their LTS. In producing our own 2050 strategy, we wanted to set a clear framework for progressing towards net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, as well as transitioning to an economy and society that is resilient and can adapt to inevitable impacts of climate change. But most importantly, we wanted to do this in a way that promotes sustainable development and a future well-being of the Marshallese people, women, men, and youth. Great. So on these next couple slides, I have some graphs and some highlights from the Marshall Islands LTS. On this slide, we've listed a few highlights and essential points, which will be helpful when we get into our exercise later in this session and consider how to develop an LTS. First, this LTS has clear and transparent goals for emissions reductions to 2050. There's a focus on the electricity sector and a 100% renewable energy. In addition, the Marshall Islands stresses the importance of developing a national adaptation plan to elaborate on adaptation and climate resilience milestones. The graph on this slide identifies the NDC trajectory alongside multiple other emission projection scenarios. The y-axis on this graph shows greenhouse gas emissions, and the x-axis shows time series from 2010 to 2050. The first 3 downward lines on this graph represent decreasing emissions scenarios for a moderate scenario, a significant scenario, and a lighthouse scenario. In addition, the NDC 2025 and 2030 targets are shown on this graph with the plus marks as part of a trajectory line to 0 greenhouse gas emissions in 2050. And as we mentioned before, an LTS should be considered, developed, and adjusted in the future to align with near-term NDC targets. A sector-by-sector approach, as we talked a little bit about before with the earlier examples, is an essential way to build up an LTS and figure out which goals, which targets are reasonable for each sector, and set those specific goals and pathways to 2050. So the graph here shows greenhouse gas emissions on the y-axis and the same x-axis time series, similarly to the graph on the previous slide. In this case, the 4 greenhouse gas scenarios are broken down by each emission sector: electricity, transport, waste, and other, which helps delineate the means of implementation for GHG emissions reductions and climate resilience objectives within this LTS. So overall, this LTS prioritizes transparency with this type of data visualization and the importance of data quality and monitoring systems for informed policy development and to measure progress. And we'll talk a little bit more about transparency next, actually. Great, so here we have on this slide a few sections of the Marshall Islands LTS through their table of contents, which we think is an easier way to see all of the components of an LTS. After a background in Section 1, Section 2 discusses greenhouse gas emissions and goes into detail based on the sector. Section 3 discusses adaptation and climate resilience, and then the LTS transitions into means of implementation. Transparency considerations are also included later, gender and human rights, health, other social considerations, and the LTS finally ends with more detail on methodologies. So a really holistic strategy and approach is listed here. All right, well, thank you. Now that we've finished looking at this example, Marian will transition to talking about transparency, which, as you've seen on some of these slides, is a key consideration during the development of an LTS.
Thanks a lot, Katie, and hi, everyone. So like Katie just said, we're going to talk for a few minutes about what really is transparency, how is it relevant here, and why is it important? So what do we actually mean by transparency? As many of you probably know, the word transparency has a long history within the UNFCCC. It was introduced at least 20 years ago as part of what we refer to as the TAC principles for UNFCCC reporting. As you can see in the definition on the table in front of you, transparency ensures that all assumptions and methodologies are clearly explained and documented to facilitate replication and assessment. So transparency is the T in the TAC principles, and it also is quite relevant to all of the other principles because the only way to demonstrate these principles have been adopted and are present in your long-term strategy and other reporting is to transparently document them. So what is TAC? So transparency we just discussed and defined. Accuracy describes how certain you are in the information you're presenting and describes some of the uncertainties that might be part of your analysis. Consistency is specific to the time series. Is the time series that you're presenting internally consistent with respect to the data used over the entire time period? Is the information you're presenting comparable to that being presented by other parties? A key example here is the same GWP used? Are you using methodologies that align with the guidance that comes out for doing GHG emissions, for example? And then completeness is also key. What geographic region are you presenting by sector? Are you complete in describing all of the sectors that are relevant for your strategy? And are you complete across the time series? So again, through those examples, you can see that being transparent about how accurate you are, whether your information is consistent across the time series or whether there are any differences, whether you're using methodologies that might differ from what other countries might use, and whether anything is missing from your reporting are all very important things to ensure that your long-term strategy and other reporting documents are transparent. Next slide, please. So plainly speaking, transparency is really about documentation. It's not asking specifically that you do more work in all cases, but describing very clearly the process that you used to do your analysis, what data you used and where it came from, how you use the data and the methods to develop your analysis. And by doing this, you make it plain to your users and your readers about how you did what you did and what's missing, importantly, and how to interpret your results. You spend a lot of time creating a long-term strategy. Being transparent about it will help it be much more useful to your team and all of your other stakeholders. Some examples of transparency include, what models did you use to prepare your projections? And what do you know about those models and their strengths and weaknesses? Are your data based on published reports, such as national statistics? Or maybe some of them are based on assumptions that you had to make along the way. And what are the boundaries of the analysis in time, in geography, and across sectors? All of this should be documented so that it can be sufficiently replicated and clearly understood. So that might sound like a lot of extra work. As I said, it's really about writing things down and making it very clear to the reader how you did your analysis. And there are a lot of benefits that can pay off from being transparent in your LTS. So using the best practices around transparency supports good governance, for example. It builds trust among your constituencies, other parties, and the public, by showing the basis of your data and your processes. It also supports accountability by showing perhaps how progress might be tracked as you move along your long-term strategy and your NDCs. It also demonstrates technical rigor. It allows your peers, whether that's within the ministries or perhaps the consultant teams, to replicate the results so that each time an update is created, the information on which that update can be built is clearly documented and can be leveraged to make improvements for future reporting. It also provides for alignment across the short-term and the long-term planning documents to ensure that there's comparable information, assumptions, and decisions being made among longer-term and shorter-term strategies, such as your NDC. And it also may increase the environment for investment by demonstrating the maturity of your planning process and investment readiness of your decisions. Here I provide one example, but there are many examples to use to look at in terms of transparency across the entire UNFCCC reporting process. We're using the US example because that's the one we're most familiar with, but there are many, including the ones that Katie just demonstrated a few moments ago. I'll walk through a few of these examples to just point out a few transparency items within them. So in the first arrow, you can see that there's a table referenced of where all of the data is reported clearly about what assumptions or other data were being applied. Interestingly, this first example shows that the information from 2040 forward was assumed to be constant. That's a key piece of information for a long-term strategy. You obviously have to decide on your projections using some decisions you're going to make about your analysis, holding it constant, growing it based on historical rates. Those are information that your readers can use to understand the policies and the strength of your long-term strategy. The second example highlighted by the second arrow presents another interesting piece of transparent information, which is that these O&M costs were developed for this report for 2010 through 2040. So that signals to the reader that the analysis was new and was created for this documentation. Again, it states that the values after 2040 were assumed to be equal to those in 2040. So again, holding that data constant in the out years. And then the final arrow shows the data presented clearly in a tabular form so that any of your users or readers can look to see whether those data or these assumptions align with what they're doing for perhaps related analysis. One important note before I close about transparency and uncertainty: carefully documenting the assumptions that you make will really help your readers understand your decisions and perhaps understand how the analysis might change if they were to apply different assumptions where some assumptions have been made by the analysts. So that's just a host of examples for you to consider as you think about what transparency means as you create your LTS. And now I'll turn it over to Jen.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Sam, Katie, and Marion. And we have some time for Q&A. You know, I know some of these concepts are new to some folks here, and some of these concepts are things that you've all been working on for a really long time. So, of course, we'd love to hear your perspectives and your experience. Perhaps the first thing, I want to get to Kareem's question before we take other Q&A. And Kareem's question was, is an LTS or can an LTS be the same as your NDC, or can your NDCs make up your LTS, or is it expected that the LTS will have more detail than the NDCs have? I'm not sure who wants to take that question, but I'm going to pass it over to you.
Yeah, I can jump in. So thanks, Kareem, for your question. I think it's a really great question. I think we started to talk about some of the interconnections between NDCs and LTS. So I think at a baseline, because of the differing timescales, because LTS projects models and forecasts out to 2050, whereas your NDCs tend to be on a more recent or shorter timescale, they can't be the same document. However, those shorter timescale projections and objectives you're setting out in your NDCs can certainly be folded into your LTS. So they certainly can work together, but they're not necessarily identical based on the differing timescales. I hope that answers your question, but let me know if you need. I'm happy to provide some additional thoughts as well.
Thanks, Sam. I have to figure out how to use the mute myself. So we talked a little bit about transparency, LTS, and NDCs. I want to open up the floor. Yes, NDCs are more short-term, Kareem. So I want to open up the floor to folks if you have questions for our three presenters, or even something that you'd like to share in your experience as you've been putting together your LTS or working on any transparency issues in your country. Feel free to unmute your mic, and if you'd like to show us your face and video, please do that. Let us know who you are, and we'll open up the floor for any questions for our speakers.
Hello, Jan.
Go ahead.
Hello, this is Dedi from Indonesia. I just want to ask about how do we track the progress of the LTS? And is there any requirement for the countries that are submitting their LTS to follow up the LTS with some maybe interim report, or how they track the progress of the achievement of the LTS targets? Thank you.
Great. Does somebody want to take that? Sam, Katie, or Marion, your mic is muted. Thanks.
I figured I'll go for it, but I think Sam might be able to offer some from the examples that she provided. But there was a graphic that showed the lines. Logan, maybe you could go up to the graphic that showed the lines between the NDCs and the LTS. It was blue, and yes, this one. So as you can see right here, there are envisioned opportunities for the LTS to be revised along the way. So that goes hand in hand with tracking. I think tracking and reporting how you're doing is a way to demonstrate, again, transparently, how well you're doing towards your target. But a key way to do it is to review the information along the way and then provide an update that can either fold into your subsequent revision of your NDC or your updated NDC or a revised LTS, to be able to demonstrate in that revision how things have been going, what situations might have changed. You know, we're sitting here in 2020 and the coronavirus has changed everything. And so certainly that's the type of thing that would be discussed in an LTS revision. And that is also where you can demonstrate the type of progress that you've been making along the way. I think there might be people who are practitioners on the line right now who might be able to contribute to this as well, to say how what processes or systems you might be putting in place to show your constituents how you're doing along your long-term strategy. But I would say the simplest and most straightforward way would be through those subsequent revised documents that can describe how it's going and how you're making any changes.
Thanks, Marion. Are there any practitioners here that, before we take a next question, want to add to that based on their experience to what Marion said? And if not, we are going to take a question from Kelly first, and then Charles.
Okay, thanks everyone, and thanks for the very clear presentation. I guess maybe it's a two-part question. One, I wanted to know from your experience and your analysis of the LTS to date, if you could talk a little bit more about ownership of the process and kind of what public agencies in particular, and maybe how they're involving the private sector or civil society. Because for me, it seems like if the goal of the LTS is to get on board with a vision and get everybody moving in the same direction, that participation in the process and having the other actors understand is fundamental. And in that same vein, I mean, in many of the small and developing states, and I know there's a lot of people connected there, I work particularly supporting the agricultural sector in all the countries in the Americas. And, that is a fundamental sector, particularly in Latin America, not as much for the Caribbean, in terms of low emissions development. But we're working really hard to get them just to start thinking about the NDC processes and getting them, up to date and on board and understanding the importance of these processes. And so I just see a lot of challenges in having so many planning processes when there's limited capacity kind of as it is to do this. And so again, with the question of the actors, I mean, are a lot of countries just hiring external consultants, or, particularly in some of the Caribbean islands, there's very limited public sector staff to deal with all these issues. So I just wanted to get your perspective on how that's actually playing out in a few of the countries that have already submitted it. Thank you.
I think that's a great question, and maybe Sam, you can take that, but there are several countries here who are currently working on their LTS. Maybe I can point out the folks from TNT and Colombia who are here, and they can also perhaps speak to the use of consultants and their LTS.
Yeah, so I'm so glad you actually raised the question of sort of stakeholders and the wide range of individuals that have to be involved in this process, Kelly, because that's actually sort of a key question that we're going to be discussing in detail in our breakout groups is who are all of the actors that you have to bring together, and who are the people that sort of have to be in a room and talk to each other in order to facilitate this process effectively. And as you said, that's complicated because there are a lot of people that can fall under that list. It could be specific power sector planners, right? Or members of a utility, as well as sort of ministry officials. So I think there isn't a clear-cut single answer to how you navigate that, but it's certainly a challenge of how do you convene all those stakeholders that we're going to be discussing in greater detail when we break out. And I don't know if Marion, you wanted to jump in as well on this.
Sure. I was just going to, sorry, Jen, I saw you about to maybe say something, but yes, I thought I would just jump in. Institutional arrangements for all of these processes are very country specific, and many countries rely on consultants across the board for this type of work. And the only recommendation that I have from the experiences that I've had doing this work in a variety of different countries is that coordination among those arrangements is critical. Doing an NDC completely separate from the inventory team, for example, could yield very mixed results. Doing your LTS with a different team than is doing your NDC could also yield very different results. I think that there's a lot that can be leveraged across both the teams and the reports, so that your consultants, for example, could do many analyses that can fit into several different reports in order to take advantage of the fact that there are limited resources, and to take the longer view of all of these different items that are both mandatory and voluntary in light of the development objectives of the country would be, a strategy in and of itself to look at all of those institutional arrangements and how they all fit together to do all of this most effectively.
And what I was going to say, Marion, is I think that Kishan wanted to offer a comment on this.
Great.
Because I know TNT is working on this right now.
Perfect.
Kishan, did you want to say something?
Yes, thank you very much. It might be a bit long, so I hope you bear with me. So I just want to give a bit of a background on how we came to where we are and how we hope to go where we want to get to. So in 2011, we, when I say we, Trinidad and Tobago, adopted a climate change policy that delineates an objective, a policy objective of low carbon, of pursuing a low carbon development plan. As part of the implementation of that policy, we developed a carbon reduction strategy to 2040. This was done in 2014, I think it was, for the three main emitting sectors that we have based on the most recent inventory that we had at the time, which was power generation, transportation, and industry. No surprises there, I guess. And from that, we were able to actually glean our nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement. We were the first Caribbean country to submit an INDC in 2015. Where we are at now in respect of the mitigation part of it is that we are validating the assumptions and the baseline. The NDC speaks to, or the carbon reduction strategy rather, speaks to a deviation from business as usual baseline, and that quantifies the cumulative emissions from the three sectors to 2040. At the moment, we are revising that baseline on validating the assumptions that we made at that time based on socioeconomic projections and so on, to extend it to 2050. So the mitigation plan is complete now. It's just going finalization and minor tweaks. So it does involve a projection to 2050. But more than that, we have included the other emitting sectors, waste and AFOLU, agriculture, and so on, in keeping with the Paris Agreement objective of becoming creating and formulating economy-wide targets going forward. So that's that part of it. In addition to that, we have developed and institutionalized an MRV system to track the emissions and to track the NDC implementation and achievement, which is now firmly established in the regulatory agency, the Environmental Management Authority in Trinidad and Tobago. We are now amending the relevant rules, legal rules, to make greenhouse gas reporting mandatory. So, and we have trained both the suppliers of data and the regulatory authority in quality assurance and quality control procedures to make sure that the emissions are checked. And as well, we are currently now upgrading the MRV system to include the ETF of the Paris Agreement, the MPGs that were adopted in, sorry for the acronym, sorry, folks, let me just say that again because there's too many acronyms. We are updating the monitoring, reporting, and verification system that we have to include the enhanced transparency framework of the Paris Agreement under its Article 13, subject to, of course, the finalization, hopefully in Glasgow next year, of the outstanding issues, according to the already established modalities, procedures, and guidelines that have been adopted in Katowice in 2018, so that we become fully compliant with the transparency requirements of the Paris Agreement. So that is well underway. The business as usual baseline, we're also in the process of training the relevant agencies to construct these baselines going forward, because we hope to dispense with the use of consultants and truly integrate that capacity within the relevant areas, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Planning, wherever they may be. So necessary skills to construct these business as usual baselines, and so improve on the uncertainties and the assumptions going forward in terms of data collection and quality and so on. So that is also is in train now simultaneously. We hope to get to one common point where at some point we will be fully sufficient in developing baselines and determining mitigation options. The baseline validation project, the long-term strategy, also includes an analysis of the intervention options required to reduce emissions, the socioeconomic impacts they may have, the technology implications, and we're doing a technology needs analysis as well, and some of the assumptions based on revenue and socioeconomic GDP issues and so on and so forth. So it takes the broad consideration, all of the socioeconomic, physical planning, industry, all of the emissions related activities that need to be incorporated into constructing this baseline. From the adaptation perspective, our approach to adaptation is not, and this may sound a little bit surprising, but I'll explain, it's not to adapt to long-term climate change via a project-based approach. Because long-term adaptation will take place for long-term climate change based on scenarios of climate models and downscale climate models for small island states and so on. Our approach is to assess climate vulnerability to climate risks in the short to medium term by looking at extremes and variability. And build resilience. And the idea is to integrate climate resilience into national development and national development planning in all sectors. This is really a pathways approach, keep bearing in mind what the long-term impacts are going to be based on scenario development and so on. So it's a front-end and a back-end approach. The front-end approach gives us the opportunity to revisit intervention options to make sure that they're working, because the risk of it makes no sense in our view to employ project-based adaptation now for impacts that will take place in 50 years. Because of the uncertainty in the climate models, the science is now becoming clearer, the impacts are changing, and of course it increases the risk of maladaptation going forward. So our approach is a bit front-end and back-end, constantly revisiting the vulnerability profiles of the sectors and so on. And we are at the moment looking at building resilience specifically to climate risks in the agriculture and water management sectors because of its importance and its nuances, and also in the health sector. But we've already done a climate risk vulnerability profile, both based on sectors as well as geographic areas within the country. All of this just to say that we will be hopefully compiling all of this once they're completed, and we know what we are talking about, into a long-term strategy for climate change and climate risk and climate resilience planning. So it was a bit of a mouthful. I can come back to any questions.
Thanks, Kishan. I think that sets us up really well for the discussions we're going to be having over the next few days about integrating climate risk into the work that we do, as opposed to having it sit siloed. We are going to move towards an activity, but before we do that, I do want to catch the last couple of questions. Charles and Mikhail, can you just quickly ask your questions? We'll see if we have time. If not, we'll kind of parking lot them until the end of this session and then get to them then.
I'll park my question until the end.
Would you mind typing it into the chat box so we can just make sure that we get to it?
No problem.
Excellent.
Hi, I would have liked to have parked my question, but I think it would perhaps determine the thrust of the way forward. Let me just say quickly that I am totally supportive of the process of the LTS and NDCs. And I want to underscore the fact that it's a process that reflects a commitment on the part of the countries, particularly the 17 countries that have submitted LTSs. But there's a missing link there somewhere, and I think Kelly referred to it. And that is, from my experience, most of the small resource-poor countries, particularly those in the Caribbean, seem to produce their NDCs, none of them have done LTSs, as a perfunctory measure. And that has happened in other guises when they used to have to produce the medium-term economic strategy programs for the World Bank. It was the same thing. It's just perfunctory reporting. And what seems to be missing in that equation is how to get them to commit to ownership of the process by an embrace of the importance of a sustainable, resilient approach, given their limited resources and the fact that they are desperate to deal with job creation, and economic development in the unidimensional way that they understand. So that's just what I wanted to raise.
Excellent, thank you. So this is all really great discussion. We're going to continue this discussion in groups. And to do that, what we are going to do is actually break out into 4 groups. I think it's going to be a little bit easier for us to have discussions in some smaller settings. So to do that, what we have done is created separate breakout rooms based on your sign-in sheet. So if everyone can navigate first to the sign-in sheet, I'm going to put a link to the sign-in sheet in here. And you will see a number to the left of your name. If you did not sign in yet and you just recently joined us, please sign in on this sheet so that we can assign you to a group. What we have essentially done is we created a TNT team since there's so many folks from Trinidad and Tobago. I think we also created a Bahamas breakout room, and then we have a few other breakout rooms where we're combining some people together to start a discussion and walk through the status of LTS and NDC planning in our countries, recognizing that we are all in a little bit of a different place for that. So I see a few folks have signed in. So if you can take a look, remember your number. And then what I'm going to do is put our breakout rooms right into the chat box. So before you go into your breakout rooms, please mute your microphone that's in this tab, but don't close this tab when you go into your breakout rooms. So breakout room 1 and 2, I have put here in the chat box. And then let me grab breakout rooms 3 and 4. And put these in the chat box. And Charles, I see your question. We will be sure to get to that and document that for you. So if folks can keep it muted in here, hop on over to their breakout room, and you'll hear from Sam, Katie, myself, and Logan on some of our next steps for the next few minutes. Great, thanks, Logan. So I know we had a chance to talk in our small groups about ongoing LTS process in your country. You know, I think there are a few groups in here who do have an ongoing LTS process, and a few of you are here because you're trying to understand a little bit of, okay, well, what do I do to start this process going? So are there, if you are currently undergoing some type of start to an LTS process, will you type that in the chat box so we can get a feel for how many people or how many countries, perhaps type the name of your country in the chat box so that we can get a feel for how many folks are starting to go through this process. And then perhaps I can call on a few countries. So it looks like Colombia, Indonesia, are already going through a process to develop a long-term strategy. Spain is as well. I know Trinidad and Tobago are, we just heard about it. Excellent. So I'm going to call on a couple of you to share with us who your kind of leading entity, because this idea of stakeholders came up in our discussions previously. So who's leading this process? So I'm wondering if Colombia, can you share with us who is the lead agency on this process and who are the relevant stakeholders that you're engaging?
Okay, thank you. In a Colombian case, the leader of this process is the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development, and of course, within the relevant stakeholders, we have almost all the different ministers in the country and the public agencies like a national planning agency. And we are trying to involve not only the public sector, but also the private and the sector and the social society to have a broad picture in how is this vision of the country in the long term. And we are trying to create a very participative process within the country.
Excellent, thank you. Bahamas, can you share with us kind of who is leading on your LTS process? I think that you have an LTS process, and who the relevant stakeholders are in your country.
All right. In terms of the Bahamas, there is currently no LTS strategy in place. However, there's been a determination that the likely stakeholder that would be involved with this would be within the National Climate Change Focal Point. So the Department of Environmental Planning and Protection within the Ministry of Environment and Housing, and incorporating stakeholders such as those that make up the National Climate Change Committee, particularly pulling out those stakeholders related to power and energy, transport, agriculture, and in addition to the finance and the tourism sectors. Am I missing any other questions? Challenges. I think that figuring out the best way to coordinate these stakeholders to make the strategy put together is important. Pieces of information that I'm missing. I don't think it's that we had a discussion around that in our group. But I think that we'll have more opportunity to do that later. In terms of more information required, we didn't have an opportunity to discuss that as well, but we do believe by finding the appropriate stakeholders in place, we'll be able to find out where some of that gaps in information exist. We also had St. Lucia in our group, but I don't know if you'll be calling out separately as well, but I'll be guided by the moderator.
Thanks, Charles. Maybe we should call on St. Lucia. St. Lucia, can you share with us, do you have an LTS process? Just these first top discussion points, and who's the kind of body that is in charge of that process and the relevant stakeholders?
No, there's no LTS process currently in St. Lucia. But I think if it were to be commenced, it would probably be led by the National Climate Change Focal Point, the Department of Sustainable Development, but again, in collaboration with other departments and ministries and other non-governmental organizations. But I can't really answer that question in full.
Not yet is the answer, it sounds like. So we keep hearing a lot about convening stakeholders and how challenging that can be and how necessary it is to create a process for convening those stakeholders. Maybe Cindy from TNT or somebody from TNT, can you share with us what is your stakeholder coordination mechanism? How do you regularly convene these stakeholders and engage them in this process?
Thanks for the question. As I was just telling the small group that we were in, we have in Trinidad and Tobago a focal point network for climate change and by extension the other multilateral environmental agreements to which Trinidad and Tobago is a party to. And this focal point network is cabinet appointed in that the representatives have a specific role to engage in this process. And so far we have about 200 representatives spanning the public sector, so all of the government ministries, statutory agencies, and so on, as well as the civil sector, NGOs, and religious faith-based organizations, the indigenous community, private sector in terms of companies, including those in the hydrocarbon sector, and the fiduciary sector to an extent as well. It's an evolving list, so as far as we can, it's updated in real time, and it works both ways in that we share information with them. They are supposed to share that information with their particular agencies and come back with the relevant feedback and so on, and then vice versa, they share what's happening on their side in terms of what their organizations are doing and what their issues are and so forth. And this has allowed us to have a working list in real time for engaging in any of those processes that Kishan described earlier. So at any point in time, if we are in need of to consult with a group for particular issues. So for example, the vulnerability and risk assessments that we were doing, technical working groups were formed from that focal point network. So agriculture had its technical working group, tourism sector had a working group. There was a working group specific to the island of Tobago because their issues they're so small, so all the issues were so interrelated to each other. So that is the approach we have taken in Trinidad and Tobago. I think it's a comprehensive one in terms of challenges with that approach. And I think this would apply to almost all other countries, especially developing countries like ours, where turnover of staff. So someone leaves, so you have that continuous need to build capacity and share information to keep the process going. But I don't think that's a challenge that's insurmountable. I think we've been doing well in terms of that continuous capacity building and engagement with stakeholders.
Excellent, thank you. That's really helpful. And noting the time, maybe just one more quick discussion point. Maybe I can ask Spain, Beatriz, is there an LTS process? It sounds like there is. And who is the ministry leading this process, and who are the relevant stakeholders?
Thank you, Jen, for the question and for the space and training. In Spain, yes, our LTS is under consultation, so already finished and public consultation ongoing. And the body in charge is the Ministry of Energy and Environment. So since 1.5 years ago or 2, we have both sectors in one ministry under one minister. That I think it's very good to be able to convey the interest of the energy and the climate change priorities. And to add up maybe something different, I think that some important stakeholders, or I was wondering, are, for example, the education sector. I mean, we need to communicate, we need to foster capacities, information sensitization. So how do we do that, and we build common shared scenarios of the country that we want in the 2050. I also think it's important the science university sector regarding the modeling to build a robust LTS. We do know that modeling is quite important. So in the case of Spain, several think tanks have supported the government to do this task. So I think that's important. And for sure, private sector, we need to have them on board. And in our case, we have still energy based on carbon. So we need to, we are working on just transition, strategies and solutions on the field. And also regarding Spain, all the subnational governments, regions, cities, and municipalities are key actors also. That's from my side.
That's really interesting, and I think that's interesting for all of us to note the importance of the education sector in thinking through the LTS and the capacity that you will need to do this, as well as engaging subnational entities such as municipalities. I want to be conscious of time, so we're going to just move to conclude. But what I am trying to do is capture questions that are coming up in the chat box in our parking lot. I like to call it a battery bank because we're talking about long-term strategies and decarbonization. And that document is in the Google folder. So if you want to drop anything else in there, please feel free to do it. And we'll also stop recording after we conclude and perhaps leave the channel open for a little bit. Logan, would you mind hopping to the next slide? So a few key takeaways, we've heard this, we've articulated this. LTSs are a strategy or plan that set a vision and pathway towards low emission development in 2050. So they're much longer term than NDCs. LTSs contain a variety of components. They often include a GHG reduction target, sector and adaptation objectives, and climate risk considerations, which we're going to dig into next session. Transparency, as we heard from Marion, includes documentation and reporting of information. And integrating climate risk, which we haven't gotten quite to yet, is going to improve the resilience of your LTS and help contribute to long-term objectives. I know that that question came up, and it's something we're going to really dig into next week or next session. So we have a lot of resources. What I've done is also, these resources are available in the PowerPoint decks. You can click through this. You unfortunately can't click on your screen, but I've also dropped these into a resources document. Again, that's also in that Google Drive so that you can click on these links. And of course, if you want to add any additional resources that you think are useful on LTS, please add them in here. The point of this is that we can share what we know with everybody here in the room, or in the virtual room at least. And with that, we want to conclude this session, and thank you, of course, for showing up. Again, we hope to see you on Wednesday as well. And in the interim, we will send out more materials. Please feel free to email us with any questions, feedback, or comments. And I think, can you go back to the overview slide? Yes, we'll pop back one more time to the key takeaways. And we will leave this open for the next few minutes, maybe 10 minutes. We'll stop recording, however, and if folks want to continue any discussions with each other, we will leave this open for about 10 minutes.